Welcome back, our alumni of the Divinity School, Graduate Department of Religion, maybe even an Oberlin graduate out there. In any case, last night we heard a terrific lecture on religion and violence and the relationship between the two. And today we're going to continue that conversation on the topic, strong religion, weak religion. Please join me in welcoming our co-lecturer, our Scott Appleby.
Good morning. You can hear me okay there, huh? Good. I want to say I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation from Dean Hudnut Boimler and all the folks here. I think some of you were here last night. There may be some who were not. Briefly last night we explored three concepts that help inform a discussion of the major question of why religions can produce people who, in the name of that religion, kill, and these religious communities can also produce people who, in the name of that religion or in devotion to God, to the sacred, heal and seek reconciliation and forgiveness. I can shout. Okay. Those three concepts were briefly this. We talked about militance as a religious norm. That is the idea that the dynamics of religion call forth in people, in believers, a dedication, a commitment that is self-sacrificial and total, and that subordinates all other goods, family, friends, loved ones, nation, to what is perceived to be the ultimate good. And so those who are committed in a religious sense believe they are committed to the ultimate reality and that they are called to give a full measure of devotion and loyalty and dedication to God as they understand God, as they understand the sacred. However, the question becomes, how do we understand, how does that believer, how does the community understand what they're being called to do? And this is rooted in an experience of the sacred, an experience of the holy, of God, if we use that term. And that experience itself is a complicated, multi-layered experience that is ambiguous. And it's ambiguous by definition, because if we understand by the term God, that reality, the reality which is beyond human comprehension, the reality that comprehends us, we don't comprehend. The Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner defined God as absolute reality, that reality which comprehends us, which we do not comprehend. If this is the reality we're engaged with, then we are not able to fully comprehend, and so there's an element of ambiguity, of uncertainty, and the requirement of interpretation. How do we interpret, how do we make sense of the encounter with the sacred, with the holy, with God, whether that's a direct encounter, an unmediated experience of God, or rather, as is often the case, it's an experience that's mediated through ritual, through teaching, through practices, through community. However that experience comes to the believer, to the adherent to the religion, there's always the necessity to interpret. And so our scriptures, our traditions, our teachings, our precepts, our ethical standards are themselves interpretations. This does not mean they're not authoritative or that they don't come from God, but it does mean that the human element in these teachings is an element of what the term we used last night is hermeneutics, a common term. What is our theory of interpretation? How do we make sense? We use symbols, we use narratives, We use ritual to make sense of this experience that is awesome, mysterious, tremendous, fascinating. And so there's a certain ambiguity and ambivalence. We can be called to extremes, to the extreme of murder and to the extreme of self-sacrifice, even unto death, out of love and forgiveness for the other. Because religion is a matter of interpretation, and because the traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Sikhism, these traditions are multi-generational, they're cross-cultural, they are complex, they are internally plural. The scriptures themselves, of course, as we study them, have been written over generations, over centuries, from different points of view, different levels of inspiration. There are many theories and debates about inspiration of scriptures and how that works, so to speak. Nonetheless, we're talking about a living tradition which is always interactive in each of these cases, always being debated, always being contested. There is no definitive, final Christianity or Islam or Judaism. There are Christianities and Islams and Judaisms and so on because they are fluid, they are malleable, they are human, they are alive. And as a result, we talk about the term internal pluralism. So we talked about militance as a religious orientation or norm. We talked about the ambivalence toward the sacred, that is, we can move in various directions in response to this awesome power. And then we talked about internal pluralism, that is, the ability for leaders in particular to retrieve from these traditions different kinds of lessons, if you will, different kinds of injunctions, different kinds of teachings, because they are vast repositories that allow that kind of, to put it negatively, manipulation, and I don't mean it necessarily negatively, it's the way we all live and understand and move throughout the world and in the world through selective retrieval and partly the construction of meaning from these experiences that we've codified and symbolized. So that, in brief, is part of what we talked about last night, the complexity of trying to understand why some adherents to religion will move in a certain kind of ethical or moral direction and others in a very different direction, citing the same scriptures, worshiping the same God, or so they would claim. And it would be too facile, too easy to say, well, this Christian is truly Christian, that Christian is not. Of course, we have to make decisions, and we have to judge in that sense for ourselves what is the proper interpretation. So one might say of the Jewish militant or the Christian crusader or the suicide bomber of whatever tradition, that person is misguided and is not reading Islam or Christianity or Judaism correctly. And this is not the proper or orthodox interpretation. Certainly that judgment has to be made. It's a different step, however, to say, therefore that person is really a charlatan, is not truly Christian, is not Jewish, is not Muslim. They're using this identity for political or territorial gains. As we'll see today, that is the case in some conflicts in which religion is a shell, if you will. But in many of the conflicts that, in fact, are quite violent, it's inaccurate to say, well, those aren't true Muslims. That's a matter of debate. That is, they are construing the tradition, they're understanding their tradition in a way that does engage the sources in that tradition and tries to do so honestly if others in the tradition would say does so incorrectly. Today, what I want to talk about, and then hope we'll have some time for discussion and interaction about these ideas, is focus on three things. Two approaches, or two patterns, I should say, of violence in the world today that is inspired in some way by religion, or that in some way engages religious sensibilities and these dynamics we talked about last night. So we want to talk about, and I'm going to use the term strong religion and weak religion to describe those. And then I wanted to also indicate that there's a whole range of movements and institutions and individuals who are inspired by nonviolent militants who are struggling for justice in a nonviolent way. And we should say that all of the movements I'm going to refer to today believe they're working for justice. Al-Qaeda believes it's working for justice. The Jewish settlers on the West Bank, Sikh radicals seeking a separate homeland in India, in the Punjab. There are very few, if any, movements that would say we don't care about justice or righteousness. The question is, how do they define it? How do they try to achieve it? So these movements are all working for justice, but I want to also shed light today a bit and talk a bit about those movements that reject violence, and if they feel that they must use violence as a mode of resistance, they put strict limits upon it, and their goals are not to annihilate the enemy, not to overcome the enemy, but to be reconciled with the enemy, even if violence is part of the engagement. So I want to try to give some details, some concrete examples of these modes of violence and nonviolence in a kind of militant framework, because they're all militant in the way we defined it last night. So first, strong religion. And I'll spend a little bit more time on strong religions than on weak religions. These characteristics come from Professor Hudnut Boimler last night introduced me and referred to the Fundamentalism Project. This is a project that was conducted by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and I co-directed it with my mentor at the University of Chicago Divinity School, Martin E. Marty, and it went on for several years and produced a number of volumes and studies of religious resurgence. I hate the word fundamentalism. I'd be happy to tell you why. I woke up every morning for 8 years wishing it had never been invented, because it's any word one would use to try to encompass the range of what I'm calling today strong religious movements. Whatever word we had used, it would have been inadequate and misleading. For example, to call religious resurgence or strong religion within Islam fundamentalist Muslims is immediately misleading if you use the Protestant Christian historical example from the early 20th century of what Christian fundamentalism was then. To refer to Islam, you're completely missing the picture. Biblical inerrancy, the notion that the words of Scripture are directly inspired and inerrant in their historical and scientific, as well as their theological meaning, to suggest that Islam is fundamentalist because it takes the sacred scriptures of Islam as the Word of God. This is to call every Muslim a fundamentalist, because every Muslim believes that the Quran, the Holy Quran, is the direct recitation of the angel Gabriel, the Word of God directly spoken to Muhammad. And we would not say that every Muslim in the world is a fundamentalist in the way we understand some Christians to be. So there are many, many problems with that term. I'm not going to use it very much today. Instead, a broader term that I'll use is strong religion. And by this I mean patterns within the world today that are found. We study them in 7 traditions on 5 continents. And these traditions, Sikhism and Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity, Judaism, Islam, I don't know if I left one out there, but these are traditions that themselves are internally plural, complicated, fighting within themselves about the meaning of their own faith and how it ought to be lived in the modern world. And within each of these major world religions, we have movements that I'm going to call strong religious movements, fundamentalisms, quote unquote. And these movements, when I say they are strong religious movements, I'm not saying strong, I don't mean strong in the sense that they are perfectly orthodox and they are the ideal, strong in the sense of good or excellent or exemplary, not at all. By strong, what we mean is that the religious element in these movements is heightened, it's strong, it's very present as religious. That is to say, the movements I'm going to talk about, from Al-Qaeda to elements of the New Christian Right, to the Gush Emunim in Israel, to the Hindutva movement in India. These are all very different in terms of what they teach and believe. But these are movements that are primarily politicized movements that often, not always, are always aggressive, always militant, and in some cases are violent. They move toward that extremist end of the spectrum. Not all the movements are always violent, but they are oriented toward the position that would say our enemies, whether they are fellow Christians or fellow Jews or fellow Muslims or non-believers or other people of other faith, our enemies have to be overcome. They must be defeated. And in some cases, they must be killed or kidnapped or captured or imprisoned or converted. That orientation of many of these movements that are oriented toward an extremist approach to violence, that, as I defined extremism yesterday, people who believe that it is a religious duty or obligation to be coercive, forceful, sometimes violent, sometimes murderous. That orientation is the orientation of the movements I'm going to be describing now. It's a movement in that direction toward violence, that orientation. And these are movements that are social and political and cultural. They're kind of multivalent in that way. But they are clearly movements that at their heart are religious. That is to say, they draw upon and they believe that they are being faithful to elements of Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Sikhism or Hinduism, etc. So they understand themselves to be religious movements, even though clearly they have political and sometimes military and cultural and social and economic elements to them and dimensions and goals. But they believe themselves to be religious. So that religious element in these movements is quite strong and sincere, if you will. Again, that's not to say that they've got the religion right, or that fellow Muslims or Christians would say, yeah, they really understand Islam, quite the contrary. But the element is strong. Now, what's striking is that there are movements like this within the major world religions that can be compared on the kind of elements I'm going to describe, the kind of characteristics. And I'm going to talk about 5 ideological characteristics for these movements. And all of the movements I'm going to describe really do exhibit these. You're going to see that these characteristics are true of religion in general, but they exist in the larger multivocal traditional religions in their full complexity. These elements exist amid a much more fulsome, rich, ambiguous tradition, and they're not combined in the same way as they are in these movements. In these movements I'm talking about, these 5 elements work together in a very heightened way. That is, they are retrieved from the larger tradition, lifted up, and really made central. So you'll recognize in these elements of religion in general, but in these movements, they become the core of the movement. They become the elements of the religion that have been retrieved, taken out of context, if you were, and heightened. So in a way, they look like traditional religious movements, but in another way, they look very different, and they behave very differently. The first of these characteristics is these movements are reactive. And this, in a way, if you had to choose one of these, this is kind of the key to unlocking the others. To say that these movements are reactive means that they come from within these traditional religions, and they are people within these religions, organizations, movements, who believe that the religion is under assault. What are they reacting to? Well, they react to a lot of different things. I'll describe in a moment. They react in Cairo. They reacted to the imposition of Western styles of business and casinos and Western values in much of the Islamic world. They react to foreign values as they perceive them, to licentiousness. They react to a lot of things, to drugs being imposed in their culture, to a whole set of values they don't like. But at the base, what these movements are reacting, what they think has happened, they interpret these maladies, these modern ills, from divorce to drugs, the breakdown of families, to violence itself, to colonialism, to foreign powers invading their lands. All of these things against which they're reacting, they interpret as caused by the marginalization of their religion. So these movements, what they share is, in India, the problem is Hinduism has been somehow encroached upon or watered down by the Muslim presence in modern India, which is a construct, or the Christian minority, or the Sikhs, or Hindus who are not practicing correctly, who become too westernized. It's the loss of true Hinduism, which is at the root of all of our problems. Or in Islam, this is a return, as we'll see, Sayyid Qutb, who was one of the major ideologues of Sunni radicalism in Islam, who was executed by Nasser in 1966, Sayyid Qutb. He was a major theorist of the Sunni radical groups like Al-Qaeda. You might kind of imagine bin Laden having Sayyid Qutb's document Milestones in his back pocket. That was kind of the manifesto. And Qutb said, what's happened in the Muslim world is that Islam has been overtaken by the West, by secularism. It has been marginalized, and we now exist in a state of jahiliyyah. That word jahiliyyah means we've gone back to the time before Islam, when the Arab world was pagan. It's the darkness, pre-Islamic ignorance, the jahiliyyah time. Therefore, Qutb said in the 50s and 60s, we can no longer trust fellow Muslims. To use a term that an Iranian coined, these Muslims have become West-toxicated, meaning they have become intoxicated by Western values, by European and American values. Poisoned in the sense of being toxic, but intoxicated, they're drunk. They don't even know they're dying. They're drunk, and yet they're being poisoned by these values. They don't know it. So Sayyid Qutb said, we are living in a situation now unlike any time since the dawn of Islam, a situation in which we cannot trust fellow Muslims. We have to takfir wal hijra, we have to name the infidel, flee, and retaliate against fellow Muslims. So the reaction of these movements is sometimes against fellow believers. Jerry Falwell, and again, I don't want to suggest Jerry Falwell was violent, because not all of these movements embrace violence directly, and we wanted to come back and say why not, what's the difference there, and we can come back to that. But Jerry Falwell, in 1960, who did he say the most dangerous man in America was, do you think? For Falwell, the most dangerous man in America in 1960. Anybody want to take a guess? John Kennedy is a great guess, first Catholic president. Any good evangelical would be worried about that. Billy Graham. Billy Graham was the most dangerous man in America. Some people say Elvis Presley. That's a good guess, too. But Elvis was not dangerous. He just was a good poster boy for what happens when the devil and rock and roll take you over. But Billy Graham was the most dangerous man in America. Why? For Falwell, because Billy Graham was not a separatist, a come-outer. He believed in the five fundamentals. He believed in 99.9% of a worldview of a fundamentalist, more of a separatist. But Billy Graham's problem was he didn't get it. He didn't understand that we have to fight back against a secular, atheistic, materialistic culture. Billy Graham will go out into the mainstream and make alliances with Catholics against abortion, or with feminists against pornography, or whatever it may be. He doesn't understand. The world is West-toxicated, jahiliyyah, not the term that Falwell used, but the same kind of idea. We've gone to a period before the Christian nation. We become a secular humanist nation. It's kind of a Christian jahiliyyah problem, right? So these movements are reacting against the marginalization of religion, and they attribute all the problems to that marginalization. So there is a man still very much alive in the Sudan. You can Google him, Hassan Turabi, who is the leader of the Islamic awakening in the Sunni Arab world in North Africa. Hassan Turabi, he came to Washington in the 90s. He was a big celebrity then, because he was, at the time, not in jail and not being beaten up by other people in the Sudan. He was in power. He was an advisor to Bashir, this terrible dictator in the Sudan. And Turabi was kind of not cause celeb, in a kind of negative way. And he came to Washington. He said, we once respected you in America when you were really Christian, but you're not anymore. You're pagan. If you were still Judeo-Christian or Christian, you would be a formidable opponent to those of us in the Islamic world. We're still Islamic, and we're creating an ummah, an Islamic community that will stretch from Southeast Asia to West Africa. There won't be any nation states. There will be a bloc. This is in the 90s, a bloc called the ummah. And we can talk with you, and we can interact with you, and we can talk about human rights if you'd like, but we know where human rights come from. They come from the Quran. They come from the Hadith of the Prophet. We have not abandoned our faith. You have. And that's why there's decadence and drugs and divorce, et cetera, in America and in the West. And I'm right now wearing a gabardine suit. I'll go back and wear the galabiya in Sudan and speak in that idiom. And so the notion here is that the world has become West-toxicated because religion has been privatized, marginalized, church-state separation, and so forth. Furthermore, this reactivity, the perception of these strong religious elements, these reactive movements that are often violent and always aggressive and militant in this strong sense, the belief is not that these are just historical circumstances or experiences, accidents, that Saudi Arabia is being occupied by Western troops, or that oil interests are plundering places in the Middle East, or that colonial powers are controlling the world, or that Islamic science has been crushed. That's not just an accident. It's a conspiracy. And it's a conspiracy that is meant to rob the heart of the faith, to drive a stake into the heart of the faith. These are not accidents. This is intentional. So when George Bush, the recent George Bush Jr., the more recent president, when he said, he came out, as you recall, and unfortunately after 9/11 he used the word crusade, which was really dumb, I must say, right? Operation Infinite Justice. And then he backed off, because you don't want to call the reaction to 9/11 a crusade in the Islamic world. It doesn't have great connotations unless you want an apocalyptic global war, which he did not. Bin Laden, Bush toned down that rhetoric and said, and made it clear in a good way, to his credit. He constantly said after that, we're not at war with Islam. We're fighting terrorism, after he initially kind of stumbled with his crusading language. And Bin Laden, who wrote frequently, and there's books collected, Bruce Lawrence has a collection of Bin Laden's pronouncements after 9/11. Bin Laden during this time wrote and said, George Bush is an honest man. He was telling the truth. And then his handlers shut him up. When he said crusade, that's exactly what it is. It's a crusade. And it's infinite justice as they see it, and they want Islam. 9/11 was, the audience for 9/11 was the Muslim world. To wake up somnolent Muslims who don't understand that this is not just an accident. This is the culmination of an American and Western and European campaign, not just for our oil, but to destroy Islam. Bush was telling the truth. It is a crusade, and then they shut him up. He's an honest man. He wants to kill us. He wants to rob our faith. So, when final example, I've got to include, since I'm Catholic, I've got to include Catholics in this panoply. I used to go around talking about all these other traditions, and then Catholics don't fit into a fundamentalist mold, not because Catholics don't produce their own aggressive reactionaries, but because they look backwards, not forwards, and most fundamentalists look forward. But nonetheless, Catholics who rejected Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, Archbishop Lefebvre and others, they didn't simply reject Vatican II, they said it was the work of Satan. This is not just a liberal mistake, Vatican II. It is, quote unquote, the smoke of Satan that has invaded the Catholic Church. And so they separated from the church. Catholics have a hard time separating from the church because Catholics believe the church is the vehicle for salvation. So it's a cognitive problem for Catholics to say, how do we solve the problem of the Pope being an apostate when we believe that the church is the body of Christ? What do we do about that? And since the Pope and the Vatican control all the resources. So the first and most important of these characteristics is reaction. These movements are reacting against something they perceive to be very powerful. And the way they react is through jujitsu. I'm using that metaphorically. Jujitsu. Marty uses this metaphor, I think, effectively. Jiu-jitsu is when you have a stronger force coming at you to overpower you, you try to turn the force against your enemy, his or her own force against them. So the second characteristic, and remember, these things all work in a logic. If you take one or two of them separately, you don't get the strong religious dynamic. The second element is they are not only reactive but selective. The jiu-jitsu means what these strong religious forces do is they imitate and draw upon resources, instrumentalities, methods of the enemy selectively to counter the enemy, to oppose the enemy. This is another way of saying that these strong religious elements, or quote-unquote fundamentalists, are modern people. They are not the Amish. They are not people who are trying to recover some previous, they will have a rhetoric of a pristine past or the time before Islam failed or Christianity failed, rhetorically, but their methods and their approach is very modern. When we study these movements around the world and these traditions, the profession that produced most what we call middle management leaders in these movements was engineering, right? Most engineers. And that's instructive because the approach of these strong religious elements in these movements is to retrieve selectively certain scriptural passages or teachings or precepts, like an engineer or an architect would retrieve tools in a toolbox because they've got a blueprint to build something new. So remember last night, those of you here, I said I'm a traditional Christian, a traditionalist, if you will, because I would be nervous about just selecting this or that from the tradition and saying, now let me combine it with Stinger missiles or American Airlines airplanes or modern technology and create something new to defend the tradition. A traditionalist would say, I'm kind of uncomfortable just retrieving that. I have to deal with the whole messy, complex, life-giving tradition. But a fundamentalist mentality, again to use that unfortunate term, that mentality is to retrieve selectively the vast tradition in order to build a new program or movement or institutional base to oppose the non-believers or the West-toxicated fellow Christians or Muslims or Jews. So I'll give you an example. There are 613 mitzvot in traditional Judaism, mitzvot, religious obligations mandated upon Jews. So they have 613 obligations, duties to perform if they're going to be fully Orthodox. The radical Jewish settler movement in Israel, the Gush Yamanim, the Bloc of the Faithful, the fundamentalist candidates there, the strong religious candidates, they come from an Orthodox Jewish background, many of them, and many of them come from America, by the way, repatriated to Israel or make aliyah to Israel. They choose one of those 613, the one that says, settle and sanctify the land. That's one of 613. They take that one, settle and sanctify the land, and subordinate the other 612 to that one. So what is their hermeneutic principle for going out and putting up tents and vans and eventually settlements in illegal occupied territory where they're not supposed to do that, which they did in the 60s and the 70s and are still doing today in Palestinian territories? Their hermeneutic for that is settle and sanctify the land. And for them, the land is the whole land of Israel, which stretches from the Nile River to Iraq. And so the occupied territories are just part of that. But the state of Israel has conquered those territories, and even though the state of Israel is run by a bunch of secular Jews, non-believers who only defer on the Sabbath to Judaism, they are useful. They still have a sacred spark of Judaism in them, even those secular Jews like Netanyahu. But they will be useful to the really religious because they're still Jewish, even in their blinded state. And furthermore, we take that one mitzvot, settle the land, that becomes the key to interpreting every other obligation. If you don't settle the land, if you don't sanctify the land, none of the rest of them make sense. That's selective retrieval of one element of the tradition in order to build something new. There's a lot of innovation in these movements. So the Christian doctrine of scriptural inerrancy, that was a doctrine taught by Luther and Calvin, correct? No. That was a doctrine developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century at Princeton, right? Princeton Theological Seminary and a few other sites around the country. And those Christian fundamentalists who developed the doctrine of scriptural inerrancy claimed, look, it's true, Luther and Calvin didn't teach scriptural inerrancy in quite the way we're proclaiming it now, but they would have if they had to face biblical criticism in the 16th century like we do in the 19th. People attacking the Bible, these non-believers who say they're Christian, who want to say the Bible is like any other book and we can use critical methods to tear it apart. We have to fight back. So we're going to retrieve the priority of the Scriptures, which is a fundamental belief, and we've got to bolster it, and we've got to reify it, and we have to make it a fundamental inerrancy of the Scriptures. They have to be lifted up. In the same way, Ayatollah Khomeini, when he came to Iran, there was no immediate precedent, no real deep precedent for an Ayatollah to become a political ruler in Shiite theology. But there was a very obscure doctrine called the rule of the supreme jurist. And he retrieved that and made it the centerpiece for his theology. And he put under house arrest the other Ayatollahs who didn't agree. I could go on and on. But the point is, these movements are modern movements. They're selective. They are people who know computer software. They know engineering. They know technical aspects of modernity. And they take that mentality toward the tradition itself. They're very pragmatic in that sense, and they're fighting back by selectively retrieving. I told the story at dinner last night that some of the people recruited to go into jihad against Afghanistan, against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s were young men in Algeria and elsewhere who in Arabic were called young men who hold up the walls. That is, they lean against the walls because they were underemployed, but they had been trained as technical scientists, as engineers, but they were underemployed because the economy was underdeveloped because it was corrupt in Algeria. So they had no jobs, but they had technical proficiency. They couldn't marry, they were frustrated, they got recruited into these Islamic movements to become the vanguard of the jihadists. I can go through the other three more quickly so we can move on. The other three elements are absolutism and dualism and millennialism. These all work together. Absolutism is that these movements, we said last night, remember these are all religious elements. I said last night that Tillich talked about ultimacy, that the religious dynamic is to give devotion to the ultimate, and to absolutize the faith. It is absolute, not just God, but the traditions, the teachings of the faith. And these strong religious elements take that tendency and really grasp it strongly. And so their approach to truth and to knowledge is an absolutist approach. That is, our knowledge, our interpretations are infallible, inerrant, absolute, literally true. They are of a type of knowledge that is different and superior to the world's knowledge, critical reasoning, modern science or technology, modern epistemology or ways of knowing. These strong religious elements like to put forward those doctrines that are most scandalous to mere rational people. So the literal virgin birth of Christ, the return of the hidden imam in glory, which Shiites proclaim, who's been in occultation or hiding for centuries, will return one day for the apocalyptic, the final moment. These kind of teachings are put forward as stumbling blocks to people who can't quite wrap their minds around literal belief in scriptural inerrancy or the virgin birth or the return of the hidden imam or the whole land of Israel as a sacred Messiah. The Messiah is there now, these Jews believe, in the land itself. These are tripwires, stumbling blocks. If you cannot submit to our form of knowledge and our authority, to our anti-modernist mentality, you're clearly not one of us. There is within this absolutism a great deal of competition for orthodoxy. Who can compete the other? And this is a kind of an interesting and a kind of ironic rationalization of knowledge and an attempt, and remember I said that these fundamentalist type mode of religiosity is very close to secular scientific. They're imitating and countering. Excuse me. So there's a kind of awkward mimesis of the forms of knowledge that the enemy holds. So the creationists, in the Christian case, want to fight secular scientists on empirical grounds. That dinosaur footprint is not 10 million years old, it's 6,000 years old. In other words, we're fighting empirics with empirics. We're going to fight you on your own terms. The mysteries of the faith are going to be proved in scientific terms. This other traditionalists would say is a kind of reductionism. It's taking the mystery of creation and reducing it to a dispute with secular scientists, and therefore divesting it of its richness, of its power, of its numinous quality, ironically, because of course that's not the intention. But when you're in a contest, when you're in a battle, you pit your form of knowledge against the other guy's form of knowledge, but there's a real symbiosis between them, a symbiotic relationship. When you go to Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, and you go to the ultra-Orthodox communities, which are intentionally set against the modern world. These are the communities in which the men they're from 48 different sects in Eastern Europe and the Pale of Russia, and they've come to Israel, and they wear 38 different, they're very subtle, but different kinds of gowns, different wearing of how their hair, etc., and they're wearing garb from the 18th and 17th century, and they're competing with one another within their community to who is more orthodox. Now, they will sell the most modern technology because they have no problem with modern technology, but their cultural environment is going to be very traditional. And so they don't have newspapers in Mea Shearim, they have plasterboard on walls and they write in Yiddish. And I was with a friend who's an expert on this community who speaks and reads the Yiddish. And one poster says, "Eat at Al's. It's a kosher fundamentalist deli. Great place." Someone came along and put a plasterboard beside that, which says, "Al is a fraud. Eat at Herbs. It's super fundamentalist, super kosher. This guy really doesn't get it." And then there was a third one, I kid you not, "Eat at Si's. These two guys are charlatans. Si is super, super, super kosher, ultra-Orthodox fundamentalists." And they are competing for degrees of orthodoxy, a very self-conscious kind of lifting up of absolutism of practice. The fourth of these characteristics is dualism, dividing the world into those who are with us and those who are against us in a very sharp way. A lot of energy is given toward identifying the enemy, demonizing the enemy, a kind of Manichaean worldview. The world is divided into good and evil. And you will know who you are by your behavior and your dress and your patterns. So if you want to know who the settlers are in Jerusalem, the radical Jews who say they're the ultra best Orthodox, they will be wearing kippahs, yarmulkes, that are twice the size of any other Jew's yarmulke, and they are in the colors of Israel, blue and white. This is like saying we are the super Jews. See how big our kippahs are? You know, the rest of them are imposters. We have the truth, and even the other Jews are in the other side of the divide. The Tamil Tigers, the liberationist movement, will wear certain kinds of shirts that distinguish them from other Tamils, and so on. Let me move to the final one of this ideological, and in a way, it's the straw that stirs the drink, so to speak, the element that really helps us understand the orientation of many of these movements toward aggressive militancy and sometimes violence. And this is millennialism, and here I'm going to use, that's a Christian term primarily, I'm using it more broadly, or you might say an apocalyptic worldview. What's very striking about these movements, in Sunni Islam, in Shiism, in Judaism, in Christianity, even in Hinduism and Buddhism, In all of these vast religious traditions, the host traditions for these strong religious minority movements, in all these movements, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Gush Emunim, the Hindutva movement in India, Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, all of these cadres of militant and often violent, strong religion elements, they're all in the minority. They're all small, relatively small compared to the larger traditions. But what they do is they find in the larger tradition, and all these traditions have them, an element of apocalypticism or millennialism, the notion in Christianity of the millennial rule of Christ at the end of time, after the rapture, so on. There are a lot of different schemes of that, won't go into. But in all of these traditions, you do have an element that portrays the religion as a minority under assault at some point in its history, and there's apocalyptic imagery or injunctions in all of these traditions. In some of them, they're deeply embedded in the history and not very active today. But in others, they're closer to the surface. But in these strong religious movements, whether they're deeply embedded elements or right to the surface, they are retrieved and made central. So in Sikhism, for example, the Sikh religion, there is this sacred book is called the Granth Sahib. It's considered the living guru. All the gurus have died. This is the living guru, this book. And if you read the Granth Sahib, it says, forgive and repent and love and compassion and compassion. However, there is a line that says, if the Sikh faith will one day come under assault, the faith itself, the religion itself, when this happens, you must take up the sword. So in the early 80s, Bhindranwala, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala, retrieved that passage and said, we are now in the dark times. The state of India is squeezing us out, and he assembled everyone in the Golden Temple at Amritsar, and it was a very violent movement, and he added the motorcycle and the revolver as elements of the Sikh insignia to the turban and the short pants and the short sword. He added the motorcycle and the revolver. Why? Because in each of these scriptures you have what I call an emergency clause. Most of the time we love one another, most of the time we're compassionate, forgiving, etc., but there will come a moment, a crisis moment, an apocalyptic moment, and there will be a scripture that says, in this case, take up the sword. In this case, be violent. Now this is very important to the strong religious movements. Why? Functionally. Because they are recruiting. Al-Qaeda has to recruit members. And they recruit from two kinds of pools. One is young people who are completely rootless, who don't know Islam at all, and they get on the web, or they come to a preacher, they don't know. But the other, the leadership, tends to be from people who are Orthodox Sikhs or Buddhists or Christians or Muslims or Jews. That is, people who are somewhat familiar with their scriptures. And if they're somewhat familiar with the vast religious tradition that these strong religious elements are pulling from, they realize that the scriptures in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, these scriptures have one verse after another enjoining love, compassion, forgiveness. You do not pick up the Quran. It does not say in all these surahs, go kill fellow Muslims, go kill the infidel. There are some lines written at a certain time, recited at a certain time, that are militant. But you'll find in the Quran all kinds of injunctions to love one another. Allah created people differently. He could have created everyone the same and they'd like one another naturally, but he wanted this diversity. It's a good thing, etc. You go into all these texts, and the majority of the teachings are not violent injunctions. So the fundamentalist recruiter has a problem when he's trying to recruit people who know something about the religion. How does he justify saying, now you're going to come into our training camp, into our cadre, into our militia, into the RSS for the Hindu nationalists, and we're going to train you in military arts, and we're going to maybe equip you to go commit terrorist acts. What's the justification? The justification is we do follow these scriptures, we do follow the tradition, and see where it says here, there will come a day when the darkness descends, you are called to be violent. This is the day. This is the Jahiliyyah time. This is the time of crisis. So that is a kind of logic for these strong religious movements. They are doing what we described last night. They are interpreting the signs of the times, their own scriptures, with very much an eye on, as they think, preserving the faith. And then, of course, these movements are multiple. They're complicated. There are some insincere religious people who are not religious. There are some people who are bandwagon jumpers. There are some people who are out because they just want to carry guns at age 17 and be men, they think, or because they're rootless. There are all kinds of motivations. But there are a lot of movements around the world that are violent like this that recruit young men who are rootless. The movements we're talking about today, and there are about 17 clusters in the world right now that are in the midst of hot conflicts. These movements are making an appeal with some core of their leaders and members who are religious and claiming to be the authentic interpretation of the Hindu or Buddhist or Christian traditions. That's strong religion. The other two things I can talk about, I'm going to have to do quickly now so we can have a little time for discussion. The second thing is, well, there are other kinds, so there are a lot of conflicts today, Al-Qaeda, a lot of the Islamic movements that we hear about, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, a variety of movements, Jamaat movements around the world, and there are dozens and dozens of them. These are what we'd call these strong religious movements I've just described. There are certain small Jewish movements around the world that fit this category. There are some Christian movements that do. Not all of them are violent, and we can talk about that if you want in the question. Why aren't they violent if they fit these other categories? There's some theories about why they're not violent. One of them is it doesn't pay to be violent in the United States unless you become a militia person who goes underground. There are other ways that one exercises political authority in a democracy without taking up guns or storing rifles in the basement of Moody Bible School. It's not necessary, and furthermore, it's not going to get anywhere if you try to do it. In a failed state, that works. That's not to say Christian fundamentalists would be violent under any circumstances, so it's not a full theory. But nonetheless, there are movements in all of these traditions that are strong, religious, and violent. But that does not exhaust the kind of violence in the world today, the wars and the conflicts that have a strong religious element. Those that I've described have a strong religious element, so I should say these, the second group, they have a religious element that we would call a weak religious element. In the long conflict for 30 years in Northern Ireland, it was between Protestants and Catholics, and it still is. It's not a strong religious conflict. The Catholics in Northern Ireland were not fighting for more Roman Catholic masses, or for people to be more Catholic, or for the Protestants to live under a Catholic state. And the Protestants, with the exception of a few people like Ian Paisley, who was a true Calvinist believer, at least in his earlier incarnation, till he came to power, he was damning the papists and the whore of Babylon, etc. I met him on a plane one day. He was a very charming bigot. And he was reading his scriptures and writing he was sitting on the plane next to me, and he was writing in the margins things in red. And I wanted to say, Reverend Paisley, what are you writing in your notation? Does this mean kill Catholics here and their demons? But he was a true believer. But in fact, most of the Protestant paramilitaries were not motivated by religious causes. Was religion a factor in that conflict? Absolutely. It was a weak factor. And I'll explain. It's called the Good Friday Agreement, not coincidentally. There were the Easter uprisings. If you look at the history of the conflict going on, it's filled with religious symbolism. Why? If you go to Belfast and you're not Irish, I've got some Irish heritage, but, it takes you a while to figure out who the Catholics and who the Protestants are. You can do it pretty quickly, but they look alike and their accents are alike. One of them says it's the north of Ireland, one of them says Northern Ireland, and that's a tip-off, right? The Catholics say it's the north of Ireland, the Protestants, it's Northern Ireland. It's a different, and there are other ways to tell them apart, but one way to tell them apart, you have to lift up something that shows that you're different from the other guy, and religion is one thing. We have a different religious heritage. Furthermore, when you bring religious motivations into a conflict, it deepens it. You're fighting not just for land and territory, but for your family, your clan, and your faith, for God. So when Slobodan Milosevic was trying to mount a campaign to expand Serbia's influence in the Balkans and to overcome Bosnia-Herzegovina and other parts of Serbia, it was very useful to lean on the Serbian Orthodox priest. And he brought them to Kosovo, where the Albanians and Muslims had lived and were contesting the Kosovo. And he disinterred the bones of a Christian martyr, Lazar, who had fought Muslims on that battleground and been defeated 500 years earlier, and he had the Serbian Orthodox monks parade those bones around the field, and he got all the Serbian Orthodox all charged up that this was a campaign against the Muslims that was a religious campaign. Slobodan Milosevic was no great Serbian Orthodox. In fact, many of the Serbian Orthodox priests or soldiers who were raping Bosnian Muslim women and killing Bosnian Muslim men and torturing them, they were singing Serbian Orthodox hymns after they did it and while they did it. But if you gave them a simple catechism, a quiz on their catechism, they would have failed it. Many of the Serbian priests might have failed it. Why? Because in that context, nationalism and religion were very much infused. And orthodoxy, Serbian Orthodoxy, had been so closely tied to the state that it was used to using the sacred symbols and the depth of this commitment of militancy of religion to support what was essentially a territorial and political fight. There are conflicts around the world that are really conflicts that are solely not about establishing Sharia or the Jewish messianic homeland or a Christian theocracy or whatever. There are conflicts that are really just about land and power, but religion is very useful in these conflicts. The religious element is weak, meaning it's not intentional, it's not very sophisticated, it's not very elaborate, but the power of the sacred is a way that these conflicts are deepened. Let me conclude then with some good news. There are, and I wish I had a little bit more time, but I'm over time now and I need to conclude. Well, I don't think you speak for everybody, but I'll just say a few things about this. And this is, and you can find all about this by going on the Kroc Institute website and getting all our propaganda on religious peace building, faith-based peace building, not only at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, but we study the really remarkable emergence, especially since the end of the Cold War, but it's really striking, that I talked last night about globalization and people questing for justice and a greater level of self-awareness on the part of religious as well as non-religious people, but our religious people, that they are agents in the world, that they are empowered, that they have technology, that they have mobility, that they can organize, and that they're not as bound by nation states or even by their religious boundaries in some ways. And what we've seen in Islam, in Christianity, in Buddhism, and Hinduism is the emergence in these religious traditions, while these strong and weak religious, violent or near-violent elements are also stewing and brewing and building, you've seen a parallel movement at the other end of the spectrum of militancy of Catholics who are beginning to talk about peace in a very serious and systematic way. Catholics have been a just war tradition. But in the 20th century, we Catholics have developed by learning partly from the peace churches, from the Mennonites and Quakers, the Church of the Brethren. We are moving more toward a nonviolent orientation across the board. I had to go give lectures and seminars and workshops in Mindanao, the southern Philippines, to Catholics who are in a terrible, long, protracted conflict, mostly against Muslims in Mindanao. It's a very long, bitter conflict. And we were trying to explain to these Catholic priests and laity and bishops and women religious what it means for them to have to be apostles of peace, peace builders, that this is their Catholic duty. And it was not immediately apparent to them that they ought to be nonviolent in this setting or at all. But I had to do the research, and they really respect Pope John Paul II tremendously, not the current Pope, the one prior, who was Pope for over 30 years, third longest pontificate in history, and was just, as you know, ubiquitous all over the world, really a very important figure for Catholics psychologically and spiritually. And if you read John Paul, beginning in 79, in 80, early on, and throughout his pontificate, he's very strong on nonviolence. He has quotes that say, you cannot use violence even if you're being attacked. It is not the way of Christ. It's really striking how strong he was consistently. And you put that up on the PowerPoint when you're in a village in the southern Philippines in which priests put guns on the altar because some people get kidnapped while they're saying Mass, and you say, You're a priest, your pope is telling you you can't use violence and we've got to learn about nonviolent techniques of resistance. And furthermore, we need to train you to be mediators and peace educators and transitional justice people. That's quite a task. But in fact, the Catholic Church, and I could say much more about this, in the course of the 20th century has moved more and more into a human rights, religious freedom, peace-building mode as one of the voices. That's being contested, as you would expect. There are Catholics who say this is the wrong direction, including religious freedom, including human rights. That's not our tradition. And until 1965, on December 8th, religious freedom was not the tradition. In 1895, Pope Leo XIII wrote a letter to James Cardinal Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore, and he said, it's called Longínqua Oceani, across the wide ocean, the English translation, Your Eminence, I'm writing you to say, I appreciate the Constitution you gave me, the copy of the American Constitution, and all your efforts to instruct me that the state of religion in the United States is not negative for Catholics. We worried about you for so long because there's this thing called church-state separation there, and there's so many Protestants, and we didn't think Catholicism would flourish, and you're talking about religious freedom as if it were a good thing. But we see that you are thriving and you're building parishes and churches, and this is a good thing, and we're very pleased with this, we, the papal we. And you can imagine Cardinal Gibbons reading this the first time, this letter, and being delighted. He gets it. The Pope gets it. This church-state separation democratic experiment is good for Catholics. And then there's a famous line, nevertheless, don't be confused, Your Eminence, in thinking that the official position of the Roman Catholic Church is to support democracy, religious freedom, and church-state separation. It is not. We consider these expedients for the time being until we become the majority, and then it becomes a Catholic state, which is our teaching. And that was the teaching until December 7th, 1965, when Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, was promulgated by the Second Vatican Council. 1895 to 1965 is not a long way as the crow flies historically, but it was a remarkable passage. That's being contested today. Peace building is being contested. Nonetheless, there is a movement within Catholicism more toward peace building. You find similar movements where you have Muslims and Buddhists and Protestants of various kinds, mainline Protestants primarily, who are learning conflict mediation and deepening those and reconciliation, transitional justice, the whole panoply of peace building that is nonviolent, the different techniques and stages of the conflict cycle, where at every stage of that cycle you need people who are practitioners. And these religious groups in all the traditions are understanding those conflict cycles from their own deep theological and religious perspectives. They are owning them, as you will. This is inchoate. It's not the dominant movement, just as the extremists are not the dominant movement, but it's a very hopeful sign that nonviolent militants, peace building, the pursuit of justice in an inclusive, non-boundary, non-absolutist, non-crusading way, but an inclusive way that builds coalitions and eschews violence, that is also bubbling up to the surface, and that is the good news. I appreciate your indulgence, and I'd be happy to stay as long as you'd like for questions and comments.
Microphone makes me a little nervous. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it seems that, and I'm not a religious scholar, so bear with me. As things, you mentioned the globalization of kind of our world. As things get more global, you can either try to work together to build a more peaceful world, or you can separate yourself in these strong religious movements. And the strong religious movements, are they kind of, would you say they're creating a new version of their religion almost? And is there ever a place where you win? And what happens after that? Do you kind of go back to the glory days, or has anyone ever won in a strong religious movement?
It depends. First of all, are they creating a new religion? That's a fair question, because, and one of the themes last night was all this is up for grabs in a way. That is, it's being contested. It's being argued about. People are accusing people of various different things within these traditions. So some would say you're a sect, or you're a splinter group, or you're no longer recognizable as Muslim or Christian, and the charge will go in the opposite direction. You long ago stopped being a Christian. You long ago stopped being a true Catholic or a Muslim. You've bought into a secular, etc., or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of debate and contestation and argument, sometimes violent, within these religious groupings around the world, in which more extremist Muslims have killed more Muslims than any other faith or secular. I mean, Muslims have died at a total of about 3 to 1 around the world, maybe more than 3 to 1 rate. That is, Muslims are killing other Muslims, and that's the tradition that is most clearly. It's also one of the world's largest traditions, and that accounts for the fact that the violence is so deep and so strong. But a lot of that is some of these more extremist groups persecuting minorities in Pakistan, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, and doing so violently. And the claim is, for example, there's a movement in Pakistan called the Ahmadiyas, who are Muslim and claim that they're Muslim, but they do not believe Muhammad was the final prophet. And so the Sunni Jamaats, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and other movements in Pakistan, the strong religious movements, persecute them, kill them, riot against them, and this has been going on for decades. So that's an extreme case, but it's not rare, actually. It's not just an exception. It's much more common. So to your first question, yeah, there's a lot of fighting about who's going to win within, here I'm not talking about one religious tradition against another, but within the religions, who's going to win? Who's going to dominate? Who's going to win the competition to be the most orthodox, the right praise, the correct Christians, Muslims, Jews, whatever it may be? That's going on all the time. It's going on in newspapers, it's going on in media, it's going on the web. If you wanted to spend the entire weekend, you can start following, really, if you get on the right websites, you'll see it all unfolding there, and you can choose your religion. So it's really a flame. Now, it always has been, historically. This is not new, the dynamic of competition for who's right and who's got the right religion. But because of technology and because higher education, higher literacy, a whole lot of factors, it's much more rampant and fluid than it ever has been before. You layer that in with the fact that there's a fragmentation of religious authority around the world at a higher rate than there was before. Young people who are mixing and matching and choosing and opting in and out, all of us, and that makes it all the more colorful, vivid, exciting, interesting, and confusing and disorienting for people at the same time. So that's the first part. I don't remember what the second part of your question was. What was it? How do you win? You don't win. I mean, one way to win, how do you determine who wins? Do people win? There are different ways of measuring that. If you're into metrics, one way is, do you control resources? Do you control, when I said before, the Catholics, the traditionalists or the fundamentalist, quote-unquote, Catholics are kind of pathetic organizationally. I say that with all due respect, meaning they don't control many resources. They don't own too many churches. They meet in basements. Why? Because the mainstream Roman Catholics still own the churches. They still control the hierarchy. There may be bitter disputes, but they still are in charge budgetarily, institutionally, by and large, right? So the wildcat groups, the groups that are breaking away within Catholicism, have a problem. They don't control as many resources as they like. They can get some disgruntled, wealthy Catholics to fund this and that, so they still exist. The other problem they have is ideological, and I did that too quickly, but They're fighting to say, we are the Roman Catholic Church. They're not saying, as the Protestants said, the Protestant fundamentalists said, fie on the Presbyterians, we're coming out of those churches and creating our independent fundamentalist church, or fie on the Southern Baptists, we're Baptists. Catholics can't do that because the church is a doctrine. It's a dogma that the church itself. So you got to fight over who controls the church. And if you haven't ordained, don't have recognized powers to ordain, this Lefebvre, who did ordain 4 bishops, was excommunicated for ordaining these bishops. So it's a real problem there. But in other places, one way that you win is you control resources. And sometimes now the way people try to win is by violence or by militias. So much of the world is in dire poverty. The gap between rich and poor is growing. The awareness that you are relatively deprived is greater than ever. In other words, people have always been poor, but they haven't always been able to grab a rifle or a grenade and recognize that the guy across the valley has it better than you do, because media is ubiquitous. And so there are more opportunities for mobilizing people around militant causes and for attracting recruits who are young, untutored, disgruntled, displaced, and so on. So in so many parts of the world, you can read, there's a great book, I'll have to tell you later, but, about dispatches across the 10th parallel between Christians and Muslims. I forget the name. Elizabeth Griswold is her name. A great book that came out recently. Just read that book. She's a journalist. It's an accessible book, and it just talks about resource wars within and across Christian and Muslim divide. Who's going to recruit the most people? Who's going to carry more guns? Who's going to get their candidates in a political party where there is a system in which you can win that way? So it's being contested in politics, it's being contested on the battlefield, and it's being contested on the web. Who wins? That depends on, in my much too woolly-minded, traditional, ineffective, non-21st century mind, the people who win are those who stay true to the faith and have a spiritual life that flourishes and that leads to compassion, forgiveness, and love. But there's not a poll that measures that. So that's one way of winning. It depends on what you think winning is. Sorry for that long answer. Yes, sir.
Could you comment a little more on the events between 1895 and 1965 that may have led to the Catholic Church's change in stance on religious tolerance, and how might have the Vatican or the Catholic Church's response during the Second World War might have influenced that change?
That's terrific. I do a course for an entire semester on that question, so you're not going to get anything but the headlines. And you pointed to one very important, there are so many factors that transform Catholic sensibilities in the 20th century. There was a whole theological movement called the New Theology in France, for example. There was finally the popes actually being willing, the church officially in the 40s, to begin to study the Bible critically, as Protestants had been doing in liberal and some modernist and et cetera seminaries. Catholics in the 40s were given permission to start reading the Bible critically and retrieving from the Bible elements of the teaching of the Bible which were not Thomistically framed, that is, were not in a kind of high church theology, but talked about justice, talked about the poor, liberation. That's always been part of the faith. But when you begin to read the Bible, which we didn't do in Catholicism, I went to divinity school at the University of Chicago with a lot of Protestants, and I'd have conversations with them as a Catholic, and they would say, oh, yes, John 12:14, and I would nod, and then I'd run back and look at John 12:14. What would that be? Because we Catholics were really, even in my lifetime, taught not to read the Bible when that changed during my lifetime. So the opening up of the Bible, the opening up of the experience of World War II and the early 20th century, where the church embarrassed itself, scandalized itself, by a policy toward the world, toward states, the Catholic Church, I mean, which were concordance and alliances. Since there was such a deep fear of communism, of atheism, there was alliances or more of a toleration for fascism. So in Spain with Franco, and then there's a lot of controversy over could the church have done more to resist Nazism. That's a big controversy. But nonetheless, the church recognized after the war that it had made a mistake in aligning itself with states. And so during John Paul II, there was more of a shift toward civil society, toward persuasion, through culture, media, and so forth, and more, frankly, gospel, direct kind of gospel value. There was also, I must say, the experience of the United States. The Church in the United States is very young, but it became a very wealthy and successful church, and one of the major architects of the Declaration of Religious Freedom in 1965 was a Jesuit priest from New York named John Courtney Murray, who, along with Jacques Maritain and some other European theologians, argued that religious freedom was, in fact, a Catholic teaching. It's debatable, but that there had been medieval sources that really talked about the freedom of the church from the state, and that church-state separation and religious freedom is really a Christian value, and they argued successfully in the Second Vatican Council. Now, Murray was silenced for a time for his writings because it was very much against the grain in the 50s and the early 60s, but he was rehabilitated, as they put it, and he was an advisor to the Second Vatican Council. So that American experience, we Americans really are quite proud of that. I've met some Europeans who like at the Vatican who like to say you weren't that important, but they're wrong. And so there are actually quite a lot of historical trends, a kind of almost overdetermined set of circumstances that led Catholicism to kind of enter stumblingly, but also kind of courageously into the modern world, and to retrieve some of the, I think, the best elements of human rights and humanism from the modern world, and to baptize them in a way. So there's a lot to that. Come take the course. I'll go into more detail. Thank you all. We'll continue to talk at lunch and after this. Thank you for being here.